Anyone tell me what these companies have in common? I'm sorry?
Breaches?
Yes, breaches. These are the top 20 data breaches of 2018. And I'll mention something about 2019 in a little bit. When I started doing the research for this talk, I ran into this statistic. 1.5 billion accounts compromised. I mean, that's mind-boggling to me. And 80% of these breaches are all due to stolen credentials of one form or another. There's a company called 4IQ. They do security analysis and consulting. They're an analyst firm, basically. And this is from the 2018 report. They have a really interesting methodology. What they do is they go on the, quote, dark web, and they find out what credentials are available to buy or have been dropped for people to consume. And then they go back from that to deduce how many data breaches were there and how many accounts have been compromised. Interesting approach. So they identified in 2018 12,000 separate data breaches, so 12,000 separate dumps of credentials that hackers had downloaded or uploaded. 3.6 billion new identities in 2018. So, you know, that's half the population of the planet, which was, of course, an increase. And in total, 14 billion records were available. So that's usernames and passwords that you can either just download or buy. And this was from a couple of months ago, from the UK. That's pretty shocking. So facial recognition data, unencrypted usernames and passwords, they just sort of left it out in the public for people to download. And I just looked at this about half an hour ago because I thought, oh, I wonder if the 4IQ report's out for 2019, and it turns out it is. There's been a 71% increase in available usernames and passwords. So you know that 14 billion number is now 71% higher. A 424% increase in the number of data breaches, and this is largely due to criminals going after smaller organizations. So instead of the really big ones, they're going after smaller ones. And as if you pay attention to the press, you know that a lot of those are state and local governments. So the organizations that classify as government agencies has increased almost threefold. So pretty frightening numbers associated with credentials. And so we know that credentials are not secure. They also suck from a user point of view because of all the reasons that we've talked about earlier today in terms of password policy, password complexity, having to rotate your passwords. User just can't deal with them. They're awful. Two-factor authentication is better. There's no question about it. It's way better, but it still pretty much sucks. The user experience is miserable, and they're phishable. And especially if you're using sort of a phone-based 2FA approach, those are spoofable as well. And these are some of the recent two-factor authentication attacks over the last few years. In particular, this last one at Hack in the Box. So Morena is basically it's a proxy. So it's a way of spoofing sessions, and NecroBrowser is an automation tool for taking captured session information and doing stuff with it, like resetting accounts and all of that. So now the whole process of grabbing someone's two-factor authentication protected account is pretty automatable. And the Morena service will actually detect which web pages it can attack and all of that. So it's pretty much set and forget. You just set it up, you tell it the domains you want it to go after, it'll go find them, try to insert itself into the whole process, and then automate the collection and then the compromise of accounts. So the cost of mounting a 2FA attack now is actually surprisingly small. So what's the solution? Well, there isn't the solution, but there's something that can improve things, and that's called FIDO. How many people here have heard of FIDO? Most of you, so that's good. It stands for Fast Identity Online, and the FIDO Alliance was started, I don't know, about 4.5, 5 years ago with the idea of getting rid of passwords. And they've been through a couple of iterations of standards. And the goal is to produce essentially a replacement for what we use passwords for today. And it's not a two-factor authentication kind of scheme, although it kind of looks like it because they can use USB tokens or phone apps and that sort of thing. The gist of the mechanism behind it is to use PKI as a credential mechanism rather than a username and password. And the advantage of that is that with a public and private key, the private key stays with your device, whatever gizmo you've got to do FIDO with. Public key goes to the application or the relying party. So now you have a situation where you have strong authentication using PKI, and the private keys can't be compromised because they're locked up on the device. And you have to go through a physical process to, generally speaking, to use those keys on the device. So you either have to use a biometric, like a facial scan or a thumbprint, or a physical presence gesture just by tapping it if that's all the application requires, or any other kind of interaction between the user and the device to unlock the key. But the private key obviously never goes anywhere. It's locked up in essentially a TPM on the device. So amazingly secure, not phishable, and actually very convenient to use for the user. And that's probably the most important thing because 2FA is a vast improvement over usernames and passwords, but the convenience factor is a problem. So there's some acronyms and some definitions I'm going to go over because I'm going to use them, and it took me a while to get through them all. I've talked about FIDO and FIDO Alliance, Universal Authentication Framework, and UAF and U2F were the two original FIDO standards. And they were not oriented towards web applications at all. They were really a set of protocols and standards for authentication between, say, a thick client and a server. There's something called FIDO2, and this was just ratified this year, I think in March. And it's a combination of a couple of things. One is some extensions to the UAF framework, which are called CTAP1 and CTAP2, and WebAuthn. This is really the important part. So the W3C, they standardize HTML and JavaScript and all of the web protocols. They added extensions to the JavaScript standard to allow JavaScript applications running in the browser to communicate with a FIDO device to do secure authentication that way. The combination of CTAP2 and WebAuthn is often called FIDO2, and that enables us now to FIDO enable web applications in a standard way. And that gives us the ability to use what amounts to strong PKI authentication using biometrics or whatever to actually use the private key. So here's how the pieces sort of fit together. You have a web application, or it could be an IDP. It could be Azure AD, or it could be Okta, or anything like that. Communicates via HTTP to the browser. And when the user goes and fetches the authentication page or the login page, that gets rendered in the browser. There's JavaScript in there, which uses the WebAuthn standard, which are essentially JavaScript APIs, to communicate through the browser runtime to the operating system, and then to either an onboard TPM, which might be embedded in the PC, so that's where the local credentials on the PC would be stored, or it can actually go to an external device like a USB key, which I'll show you how that works in a little bit, or even to an application running on a phone and communicate with NFC or Bluetooth. So you have lots of different ways to set up the different components of the system to give you the most convenient form of authentication for the user. But all of the standards work the same way across all of them. So a couple more terms here. The authenticator is the device that can actually generate the public-private key pair. And that's the credential set that a user uses to authenticate to an application or to an IDP. Attestation is basically the process of querying the authenticator for information about what kind of authenticator it is, what can it do, what capabilities it has, what manufacturer is it from, and so forth. An assertion is essentially the artifact of an authentication process. So when, you can think of Kerberos tokens or OpenID Connect tokens, those would all be classified as assertions with this. So when you go through the authentication process, the application, the relying party, gets an assertion back that describes who the user was and what form of authentication took place, and some other metadata that's useful. The relying party is the application itself. Relying party identifier, so this is essentially the way the FIDO device keeps track of the credentials on the device. So it'll have multiple PKI pairs or key pairs on the device, and it associates them each with their own application using what amounts to the URL of the web application. And we'll talk a little bit about user presence and user verification. User presence is basically some process that the user goes through to indicate that there's really a user there and it's not some sort of automated process that's going through the authentication flow. User verification is something like a PIN or a biometric, any of those things that actually verifies that the user is a particular user. So there are two steps to the whole FIDO process. One is registration. And one of the nice things about it is registration is completely user-driven. It doesn't require someone in IT to allocate out devices and keep track of serial numbers or any of that. You go through this registration process, and when you go to authenticate to an application, it says, do you want to use a FIDO device? Register it now. And in that process, you essentially put in your FIDO USB key or connect your phone or whatever it is, and through the WebAuthn API, FIDO will direct the device to generate a new key pair. The private key stays on the device. Public key, along with some metadata, goes back to the application. And the application holds on to that as part of the user's profile. So you get a username and a public key. Now, the cool thing about that, I mean, when you think about it, is the device is essentially a certificate authority. It's generating certificates on behalf of the user. So you can, in a sense, turn all your users into their own certificate authorities with each application getting its own certificate. And that's another aspect of why this is such a good approach is that because each application has its own credential, there's no way necessarily to correlate those, right? So you get this privacy feature as well. There's not like you have a single credential that you use, single secure credential you use on multiple applications. Each one's got its separate one. So the registration process generates the key pair, passes that up to the application where it gets stored with the username that the guy entered and the public key. The authentication process, the web application will put up the login form and say, authenticate with your FIDO key if you want to. And it actually sends information down about what key was used to register that account. So you put in your username, and then it will say, it'll take you to the login page for the FIDO key, and it says use this key because that's the one you registered with. Now, it might be a phone device, or it might be Windows Hello, for instance, because that's also a FIDO technology service. Goes down through the browser, which activates the FIDO device, and the browser will put up a consent dialog that says, put in this device, use it to authenticate, use a gesture if you need to, or put your thumbprint on it or whatever it is. The application, as part of that process, is sent a challenge key that gets signed by the device and then passed back to the application. The application checks the signature decrypts the whole package and checks the signature. And if it's valid, then you're authenticated. So it's now got, it's now essentially used PKI to authenticate you. So, questions about that whole process? All right, I'm going to do a quick demo here. And give me a second. Oh, good. I think I actually have to turn this off. Okay, so I've got a dummy web application here that's integrated with FIDO. Most of the code was written by a guy named Anders Aberg. It's open source code. Yeah? I suppose that I can. I mean, to be truthful, there's probably nothing much to see here, but it's just log messages from the application. Okay? And let me open up a browser. And let's go to one of the other cool things about FIDO is that you can use it as a multi-factor approach. So you can use it in addition to a username and password. You can use it as a passwordless approach where you just use the PKI credentials. So it's a username and some physical gesture. Or if you want, you can even use it as a usernameless and passwordless approach. So the user interaction then essentially becomes go to the login page, put in your device, tap it, and you're logged in. It's up to the requirements of the application and your security people as to what's the best approach for your environment, but you have those options, and they all are all standardized within FIDO. Okay, FIDO key. What do I have here? All right, so this particular key is a Golden Gate 500, I think. It's from a company called EWBM. It's a Korean company. And if any of you are interested in playing around with this, I'll give you the contact information later on in the presentation. There's a guy named Andrew who's the US biz dev guy, and he'd be happy to help you out. He's been really helpful to me on this whole thing. But anyway, this thing is a complete system on a chip plus a fingerprint reader that fits into your USB port. And okay, you can see this. I'm going to, should I zoom this up? Is this readable for you? Yeah, okay. So let me just go through the registration process here. And I'll have a password of password because that's a great password to have. Now, right now, because I have Windows Hello on this device here, it's actually prompting me, I'm going to stand over here so it doesn't actually figure out it's me. It's actually prompting me to put my face in front of the camera and use that as the FIDO authenticator. But I don't want to do that. I want to use this key. So I'll just cancel this. Oh, nuts. Here we go. Okay, so now it's asking me for a security key. Plug this in. Now it's recognized the device and it says touch the security key. So what it's doing right now is using my biometric, my fingerprint, to unlock the private key to sign the assertion that, or sign the challenge sent by the application. Cool thing here is the biometric never leaves the device either. In fact, the biometric doesn't really exist on the device. It's just a hash. But if you ever have that problem of, if you have people have an issue with biometrics getting sent off into the cloud or something like that, you don't have to worry about it because the biometrics can't leave the device.
And of course, I've got this on the wrong side of my laptop. So. Let me try this again. Wonderful demo. Tell you what, let me put it over here. So the problem is I had my fingerprint here aligned a particular way, and I had the USB key on the wrong side of the device. So let's try that again. There we go. Okay, so now what I've done is I've created a public-private key pair. The public key's gone to the application along with my username and password, and the private key along with information about the application is now on this USB key. If I go through the sign-in process now, I'll put in my username, my password, super secure password, and sign in. The application detects that I have a FIDO credential. It sends the challenge down, and it says touch your security key. So it knows what device I use to register with. It's not trying to use Windows Hello for this interaction. The little light's flashing on the USB key. You can't see that. Touch it, and now I'm logged in. Okay, so that's the MFA flow. Not terribly convenient because you still need a username, a password, and you have to go through some sort of machinations with this device. But let's try passwordless. So I'll go through the same thing here. Username, I'm just going to have a display name, and register the user. I'm going to skip the Windows Hello. And now I can touch my security key. The little key's flashing. I touch it. And now I've registered. So notice there's no password involved here. If I go in through the sign-in process, put in the username, say sign in, it knows that I used the key. It says touch it. The little light's flashing, so it tells me where I should be touching, and there it goes. So I've now logged in securely using strong authentication with no password. And the downside, of course, is I have this gizmo I have to carry around with me. But that's not so bad. These come in all sorts of different form factors. In fact, I've got one. This one doesn't do fingerprints. This one just does user presence. So if the application says prove that somebody is there, but not necessarily a specific person. So you can, I don't know if you can see that, but that's what it is. It just tucks into your USB port. And there's a little, believe it or not, a little tiny LED on here that flashes. So when it's time for you to prove you're there, you just tap it and you're good to go. So now you've got a mechanism that essentially gets rid of passwords. And you end up with a stronger form of authentication to boot.
Hey, Joe.
Yeah.
I assume then if that token goes bad or you lose it, then you have to go through re-registration everywhere you
That's a really good question. Yeah, so the process for actually using these things, and you go buy one from somewhere. One of the nice things is you know, you can just buy it as an individual. You go to Amazon and order one and get one. They're not tied to you specifically. And then as you go to different applications, you register with using your key. If you lose your key or if the key goes bad, you basically have to go through that process again, so you re-register. But it's fairly straightforward. That's not a complex process. Yeah?
One of those keys can't register multiple keys and use as backup. On some of them you can, I don't know about the ones you use.
Yeah, say that again, please.
register
On a
multiple
lot of those
keys.
keys, you can register multiple keys in the application, and then
Yes.
backups not.
Yeah. So the question is, can you as an individual use multiple keys and register multiple keys with an application? That would be up to the application, really, not the key so much, because each one will generate a separate PKI, public-private key pair. So that's certainly a possibility. Any other questions? Okay. And actually, just for grins, let me show you how this works with Windows Hello. Go through the passwordless thing here. So this is the registration process again. And right now it's flashing the camera at me, so I'm just going to stare at it. And now I've registered that way. So same process. Instead of using a thumbprint to unlock the key, it's a facial recognition thing using a camera and an IR camera. If I go through the authentication, it knows that it, and now I'm logged in, so easy enough. All right, let me go back to the presentation here. So my offering to the demo god was sufficient. So what we've covered here is basically how FIDO2 works, why it's more secure, why it's actually very convenient for users to use. There is the ability to have a FIDO app on your phone, so you can use Bluetooth with your phone to do it, so you don't have to have an extra device. Now, I haven't used that application yet, so I'm not quite sure how what the user experience is. But I can imagine it's pretty simple.
But you're also going to have to go through the registration process anytime you change your phone, right?
Yeah, so that's actually one of the things, what if I lose my token or phone? So there's no way to export the credentials from a device and import them into another device. That's like counter to the whole notion. So you basically go through a re-registration process. So that's, the flow is simple. It's kind of an inconvenience, but essentially when you go to another website and you don't have your old token anymore, you have to go through the registration process. Another issue is how do you manage, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So now, wouldn't the registration process be different than a recovery process? Because I lost the key.
Right.
And it's
You want to keep the account. Yeah. So
the recovery process when you're implementing hardware authentication.
right. So the point is that there is a separate process for doing a recovery, and that actually needs to fall back to some other form of authentication, which might be, a password that you set up or an email. Usually it'd be an email flow, right? Put in your email address and we'll send you a confirmation thing, and it'll let you re-register with your old account. Another issue is, do you fill these things up? I mean, you can have thousands of credentials on here. I don't know what the limit is on this particular one. But what if you want to get rid of them? If you just decide, I want to have nothing more to do with this relying party. The vendors provide an app that let you reset these keys so you can clear them out and restore it to factory defaults. That's pretty easy to do. You can list out the credentials that you have, but it's not any usable information other than you can see the fact that you've got these different credentials stored on here. An interesting one, which I haven't seen many people talk about, but because the relying party ID, the way the key is associated with the application is based on the URL. And if an application changes URLs, you've now essentially lost that association. So you have to go through the registration process again. There's no way to say, oh, here's the credential from the application that I use, but the URL's changed. Change the URL. There's no way to do that. And then you'll feel, if you do a little research into FIDO, in the crypto suite that was defined as sort of this part of the standard, there was a base of like 7 or 8 algorithms that needed to be supported, and a couple of them were known at the time to be compromisable. And so there's some argument about, well, you should have never put that in the FIDO standard. That's probably true, but they were referencing an earlier RFC that had those listed, so that's sort of how they got in there. So long as the vendors support, the hardware vendors in particular, support the stronger forms of the stronger crypto suites, it's not a problem. As far as I know, nobody's using those algorithms anyway. They just happen to be in the RFC. Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
Along the things to ponder, what about addressing questions or concerns? Because we've had this conversation back and done some initial testing as well, and then it goes to, okay, well, what is the activity about duplication, or you know, how far out are those conversations about physical device duplication? You know, somebody.
Yeah, could it be duplicate is the question. So the question is, you know, what happens if a device gets stolen and duplicated, then, you know, given back or something like that? And so I don't know the details of the electronics, but it's essentially a TPM. So there's no way, even at the electronics level, to pull credentials off of here and do a duplication. So as far as I know, there's no way to duplicate these things. So that shouldn't be, you know, it's as good as the TPM in your laptop. Yeah.
So what's your perspective on enterprise deployment of FIDO, like into essentially the Azure AD or Office 365 environment, like the Microsoft passing platform for it?
Yeah, so I haven't gone through that exercise. In fact, Sean and I have just, where's Sean? Is Sean here? No, he's outside. So we've just started implementing it at Semperis, and that's not 500,000 people, that's 35 people. So it's a different order of problem. So I don't have much of a perspective on the whole process of using it in Azure AD. It's something I desperately want to get finished, though, because I think it's, the upside just seems to be too good, right, to ignore it. Yeah?
Regarding using it with Azure AD, there was a discrepancy in the ability, so Google just released the ability to allow using your phone as a key.
As a FIDO device? Yeah, okay.
You couldn't do it with Azure AD because there was a difference in how Microsoft claims they supported the FIDO2 standard to the letter, and Google took it too short.
Isn't it weird that we...
The phone as a key with Azure AD yet.
Yep.
I think the fix coming to allow that.
I'm sure that's the case. So the comment was that Google's released this is part of Authenticator, right? It's the Google Authenticator has released a version that will allow it to act as an authenticator in a FIDO2 transaction, but it's somehow incompatible with Azure AD FIDO authentication right now. And I was just thinking it's kind of amusing that we're now, that Microsoft is saying we're adhering to the standards and these other guys are taking shortcuts. There's actually, and I should have dug this up, there's on MSDN or TechNet, whatever it is now, there's a list of the FIDO2 requirements for Windows Hello to work with Azure AD. And I think there's some specific crypto that it requires. It requires the ability to do user verification. And it also requires the ability to have multiple, on a single device, have multiple keys, multiple credentials for a single application. And there's a couple of other requirements too. And it could be that it's just one of those areas that the Google Authenticator doesn't support, and I'm sure it will be fixed shortly. That's too big an opportunity to let go. Yeah.
I have just one FYI that might be interesting to people from an Azure perspective. So apparently there's a private preview available now for FIDO sign-in to hyperjoin Windows machines. So operating system level sign-in to sort of match up with.
Oh, cool.
And so private preview requires you to get on the private preview and also use an insider build of Windows to access it. But from my perspective, it's kind of a killer feature because we can't really do a whole lot with FIDO in the enterprise without supporting that.
Yep.
But that, and it was previously only supported with Azure AD Join, which isn't that useful for us.
So, yeah, that sounds really, really cool. I mean, essentially, you get FIDO authentication or Windows Hello authentication on your
Yeah,
desktop, and then you're in.
with a roaming credential.
Right.
So you don't have to register every single place that you log into.
Right. Actually, you mentioned roaming credential, and that's something I didn't call out earlier, is one of the options that an application can specify when it requests registration is whether it's registering on a roaming device or roaming authenticator like this is. You know, I can take this out of one machine, stick it into another. Or the application could say it's got to be on a fixed device, in which case it has to use the TPM on your laptop or your desktop. Okay, any other questions? Cool, all right.
I think that's the end of the technical talk, and what we've got lined up is what? Where is Tom? Tom is outside. Do you know what's on the schedule right now? Are we all headed over to drink and golf? Oh, no, we got the panel thing. That's right, I'm sorry. Excellent, we need to round up our panels. Maybe we should bring the beer in here and have the panel discussion. Okay, well, great. Thank you very much, and we'll get the panel rounded up.